In the spring of 1941, Britain stood alone. Night after night, U-boats prowled the Atlantic, strangling the island nation's lifelines. Churchill himself would later confess that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. The mortal danger to Britain's supply routes, he wrote, gnawed at his very bowels. But on the 9th of May, 1941, something extraordinary happened in the icy waters south of Iceland. Something so sensitive that official records would be falsified for 15 years. Something so important that King George VI would personally tell those involved it was perhaps the most important single event in the whole war at sea, then apologized that for security reasons their bravery could never be properly recognized. This is the story of the capture of U-110, of a 20-year-old officer who climbed down into a sinking enemy submarine, of a German captain who realized his mistake too late, and of the intelligence prize that would help turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. It is a story that could not be told for nearly 40 years. Fritz Julius Lemp was 28 years old in May 1941, a holder of the Knight's Cross and one of Germany's most experienced U-boat commanders. He had already sunk 17 ships, but Lemp carried a secret, a burden that had followed him since the very first day of the war. On the 3rd of September 1939, just 8 hours after Britain declared war on Germany, the young Oberleutnant Lemp, then commanding U-30, had spotted a blacked-out ship zigzagging through waters northwest of Ireland. Convinced it was an armed merchant cruiser, he fired 2 torpedoes. One struck home. Only after checking Lloyd's register did he discover the terrible truth. He had sunk the passenger liner Athenia, carrying 1,100 civilians to Canada. 112 passengers died, including 28 Americans. It was the first ship lost in the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was a catastrophic mistake, one that threatened to bring America into the war. Lemp maintained radio silence. He omitted the attack from his log. He swore his crew to absolute secrecy. The Nazi regime blamed the British themselves, claiming Churchill had sunk his own ship for propaganda. The cover-up was complete, and Lemp escaped with only a disciplinary mark on his record. Now, 2 years later, he commanded the brand-new Type 9B submarine U-110, larger, more modern, more capable than his previous boats. On the 15th of April, 1941, he slipped out of Lorient on his second war patrol, hunting in the North Atlantic killing grounds. The targets were the convoys, great fleets of merchant ships carrying everything Britain needed to survive: oil, food, weapons, raw materials. Without these convoys, Britain would starve. Churchill knew it. The German submarine command knew it. And by the spring of 41, the U-boats were winning. In March alone, U-boats had sent nearly 250,000 tons of shipping to the bottom. April was worse. At this rate, Britain would lose a quarter of its entire merchant fleet within the year. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Britain could build just over 1,000,000 tons of new shipping annually. The Germans were sinking far more than that. On the 2nd of May, convoy OB-318 departed Liverpool, 38 merchant ships heading west toward North American ports. These were the supply ships heading home for another load, many sailing in ballast. Their escort was the 3rd Escort Group, led by the destroyer HMS Bulldog under Commander Joe Baker Creswell, accompanied by another destroyer, HMS Broadway, and several smaller corvettes, including HMS Aubritia. As the convoy pushed into the Atlantic, it entered the hunting grounds of what the Germans called Wolfpack West. 19 U-boats lay in wait. 6 were within striking distance. Among them was U-110. The morning of May the 9th dawned gray and cold over the North Atlantic south of Iceland. The convoy plodded westward at the speed of its slowest ship. Captain Lieutenant Lemp had spent the previous night in a rare rendezvous with another U-boat, U-201, commanded by Adalbert Schnee. The two captains had coordinated their attack plan. Lemp would strike from ahead, submerged. Schnee would attack from behind. Shortly before noon, Lemp maneuvered U-110 into position. Through his periscope, he watched the columns of merchant ships, 38 vessels, each one a target. He selected his prey and gave the order to fire. Torpedoes streaked through the water. The first struck the SS Esmond. The second found the SS Bangor Head. Both ships were mortally wounded. One crewman was killed aboard Bangor Head. The rest of both crews scrambled for the lifeboats as their ships began to settle. It was a textbook attack. Lemp had added 2 more ships to his tally, but he made a fatal error. He kept his periscope raised a fraction too long, savoring confirmation of his kills. Aboard HMS Aubratia, the Flower-class corvette positioned on the convoy's flank, a lookout spotted the telltale feather of spray, a periscope. The submarine hunter had become the hunted. Lieutenant Commander V.F. Smith ordered Aubratia to attack. The little corvette's ASDIC operator, the primitive sonar system that was Britain's best submarine detection technology, acquired contact. Depth charges splashed into the sea. The explosions thundered through the water. Inside U-110, the crew felt the shock waves like hammer blows. Lights flickered, equipment shattered. Lemp ordered an emergency dive, taking the boat deep to escape the assault. But Aubratia had called for help. Now HMS Bulldog and HMS Broadway were racing to join the hunt, their ASDIC sets probing the depths. What followed was a nightmare for the men inside U-110, the relentless pattern of depth charge attacks that every submariner dreaded. The destroyers worked systematically, their charges set to explode at various depths. Each explosion sent shockwaves crashing against U-110's pressure hull. Pipes burst, gauges shattered. The submarine began to leak oil, leaving a telltale trail on the surface. Inside the submarine, the air grew foul. The emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie blue glow. Men prayed silently at their stations, and with each new explosion, the damage mounted. U-110 was dying. For hours, the depth charging continued. 110 twisted and turned, desperately trying to shake its pursuers, but the British ships maintained contact. The submarine situation grew critical. Propulsion was failing. The pressure hull groaned ominously. The depth was becoming dangerous. Capitaine Lieutenant Lemp faced an impossible choice. If he stayed submerged, his boat would be crushed or his crew would suffocate. If he surfaced, they would face the guns of the enemy warships. But on the surface, at least, his men might survive. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Lemp gave the order, "Blow the tanks. Emergency surface." U-110 rose from the depths, bursting through the waves into the gray Atlantic daylight. Immediately, the British ships opened fire. Bulldog's 3-inch gun and pom-pom raked the submarine's conning tower, punching holes through the steel. On the bridge of HMS Broadway, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Taylor saw the submarine surface directly ahead and reacted on instinct. He ordered full speed, intending to ram. The destroyer's bow cut through the waves, aimed directly at U-110's hull. But on Bulldog, Commander Baker Creswell saw something else entirely. He saw German sailors pouring out of the conning tower, leaping into the freezing water. He saw a submarine apparently abandoned, and in that split second, an audacious thought formed. What if they could capture it? There was no Admiralty directive for capturing U-boats, no established procedure, no training. But Baker Creswell had read intelligence reports suggesting that German submarines carried coding equipment of immense value. If he could get men aboard before the submarine sank, he signaled Broadway urgently, "Do not ram." Broadway's captain ordered full astern, and the destroyer shuddered to a halt just yards from U-110's hull, releasing 2 depth charges beneath the submarine instead, close enough to convince any remaining Germans to abandon ship, but not close enough to sink the prize. Baker Creswell called for his boarding party. Sub-Lieutenant David Balme was 20 years old. He had joined the Royal Navy at 14, served during the Spanish Civil War and the Palestine Patrol. He had been present when HMS Courageous was torpedoed in the first weeks of the war, but nothing had prepared him for this. When Commander Baker Creswell summoned him, Balme was directing fire from Bulldog's guns. Now his commander gave him simple orders. Board the submarine, see what you can find. Get the documents, the books, the charts, the wireless settings, anything useful. Balme gathered his party. 8 men in total, 6 seamen, 1 telegraphist named Alan Long, and 1 stoker. They would cross to the submarine in a traditional wooden whaler, a 27-foot rowing boat pointed at both ends. The whaler was lowered into the heavy Atlantic swell. Timing was everything. The release had to come at the crest of a wave. The men dropped into the boat, grabbed their oars, and began pulling toward the wounded submarine. To save time, Balme steered for the windward side of U-110, where the waves were breaking against the hull. The whaler rose and fell sickeningly as they approached. The dark gray conning tower loomed above them, its steel pocked with shell holes from Bulldog's guns. German sailors were still in the water around them, swimming toward the British ships or clinging to debris. No one knew if any Germans remained inside the submarine. No one knew if scuttling charges had been set to blow the boat apart. No one knew if the submarine might plunge beneath the waves at any moment. Balme climbed onto the slippery deck. He drew his revolver and approached the conning tower. Through the open hatch, he could see only darkness. He later described the moment with a single word: terrifying. To descend, he would have to holster his weapon and use both hands on the ladder. If any German crewman waited below, Balme would be completely defenseless, but there was no alternative. He took a breath, holstered his revolver, and began to climb down. The descent into U-110 took David Balme through 3 separate hatches, each sealed tight despite the hasty abandonment above. As he reached the control room, an eerie blue light greeted him, emergency lamps casting ghostly shadows across the unfamiliar mass of wheels, pipes, and gauges that lined every surface. The submarine was silent. No engine hum, no voices, only the faint hiss of escaping air and the slosh of water against the outer hull. The boat was deserted, but it was also intact. Balme had expected flooding, destruction, sabotage. Instead, he found a vessel that had been abandoned in blind panic. Books and personal effects were strewn across the deck. In the wardroom, a plate of shrimp sat untouched. In the engine room, a dish of mashed potatoes had been left mid-meal, action stations called during dinner. Balme noted something else with professional admiration. The submarine was spotlessly clean, superbly constructed. There was nothing ersatz about her. This was a fine ship, but the boat was slowly dying. She was settling by the stern, taking on a gradual list to port. Compressed air hissed from broken pipes. The scuttling charges that Lemp had ordered set had somehow failed to detonate, but no one aboard the submarine knew that. At any moment, they expected to be blown to pieces. Balme sent his men through the boat, searching compartment by compartment. The telegraphist, Alan Long, made his way to the wireless office, just forward of the control room on the starboard side. What he found there would change the course of the war. The wireless office was in perfect condition. Nothing had been destroyed. Equipment still hummed with power, and bolted to the table sat an unusual device. Long studied it for a moment. It resembled a typewriter, but when he pressed the keys, something strange happened. Different letters lit up on a panel above. He pressed more keys. The results were peculiar, incomprehensible. He called to Balme. "Sir, this looks like an interesting bit of equipment." Balme recognized it immediately as some kind of coding machine. He ordered it unscrewed from its mounting munts and sent up through the hatch. The device was an Enigma, the cipher machine that encrypted every secret message in the German military, and this one had been left plugged in, its rotors still set in their operational positions. But that was only the beginning. Once they realized what they had found, the boarding party worked with desperate urgency. Every book, every document, every scrap of paper was gathered and passed hand over hand up through the conning tower to the boat waiting alongside. From the wireless office came codebooks and cipher materials, the Kurd signal heft, the short signal book used for brief operational reports, the Wetterkurzschlüssel, the weather short signal codebook, key tables, Bigram substitution tables, instructions for emergency ciphers, signal logs, paybooks, general correspondence. From the control room came charts, including grid charts showing how the German Navy divided the entire Atlantic into numbered squares, a system previously unknown to British intelligence. There were charts marking every German minefield and swept channel. There were documents detailing procedures, protocols, operations. From officers' quarters came personal papers, wallets, a camera, a cine camera, a Tommy gun. Every item might contain intelligence value. "Take everything," Balme ordered. Everything except obviously recreational reading. The whaler had been smashed against the conning tower by the heavy swell, but Broadway sent across a motorboat. Men formed a human chain through the submarine's cramped compartments, passing items toward the light, racing against the slowly rising water. Hours passed. HMS Bulldog suddenly received a report of another periscope sighting and was forced to speed away, leaving Balme and his party alone on the sinking submarine in the middle of the Atlantic. They kept working. Balme attempted to salvage equipment from the hydrophone office, but it was too large to fit through the hatches. He explored every compartment, photographed what he could with the captured SIN camera, gathered everything that could be moved. Above them, unknown to the boarding party, a drama was playing out in the water. Captain Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp had been among the first to abandon U-110. He had ordered his crew out, confident that the scuttling charges would destroy the boat and all its secrets. As he swam toward the British ships, toward captivity, he looked back. U-110 was still floating. The sight must have struck him like a physical blow. The scuttling charges had failed. The submarine secrets, the Enigma machine, the codebooks, everything were still aboard, intact, and British sailors were even now climbing onto the deck. What happened next remains disputed to this day. German survivors later claimed they saw Lemp stop swimming toward the rescue ships. They saw him turn back toward U-110. They saw him begin swimming toward his abandoned submarine, and then they never saw him again. Some German witnesses claimed Lemp was shot in the water by British sailors. David Balme, who led the boarding party, categorically denied this throughout his life, insisting no shots were fired by his men. British official accounts suggest Lemp either drowned in the frigid waters or, facing the catastrophic consequences of his failure, chose to take his own life. Whatever the truth, the man who had fired the first shot of the Battle of the Atlantic, the man who had sunk the Athenia on the war's first day and carried the secret of that atrocity ever since, disappeared beneath the gray waves of the North Atlantic. He was 28 years old. 15 German sailors died in the action. 32 were pulled from the water and immediately taken below decks on HMS Aubritia, kept carefully isolated. They would never learn what happened after they abandoned ship. The secret of the capture would be kept from them for decades. The boarding party worked for nearly 6 hours. When Bulldog finally returned and Balme's exhausted men were evacuated, they brought with them the most important intelligence haul of the naval war. The Enigma machine alone was priceless. Though the British had recovered rotors from other sources, this was the first complete functioning naval Enigma captured intact, its settings still in operational position. The Germans used a more complex version than the Army or Air Force, with 8 rotors to choose from instead of 5, making their naval codes exponentially harder to break. But the accompanying materials transformed the capture from significant to decisive. The codebooks provided the current cipher settings, valid until the end of June, 6 weeks during which Bletchley Park could read German naval communications without the need for cryptanalysis. The short signal books gave British codebreakers the cribs they desperately needed, known plaintext that could be used to attack future messages. The bigram tables and indicator procedures revealed how the encryption system worked at its deepest level. Commander Baker Creswell made a critical decision. He would not risk radio communication. Any signal about the capture might be intercepted by the Germans, alerting them to change their codes. Instead, he set course first for Iceland, then for Scapa Flow, the great British naval base in the Orkneys. Attempts were made to tow U-110 back to Britain. If they could bring the entire submarine home, naval engineers could study every aspect of German technology. A tow was secured, and the strange procession began, a British destroyer towing a German submarine across the North Atlantic. But U-110's wounds were mortal. Throughout the night, she settled lower in the water. The list to port increased. By the morning of May the 10th, approximately 17 hours after the capture, it became clear the submarine would not survive the voyage. Whether she sank on her own or was deliberately scuttled to preserve secrecy, U-110 slipped beneath the waves and was gone, taking the physical evidence of the capture with her. It would prove a blessing in disguise. When HMS Bulldog reached Scapa Flow, Lieutenant Alan Bacon was waiting. Bacon was the liaison between the Navy section at Bletchley Park and the Operational Intelligence Center, one of the handful of people who understood exactly what the captured materials meant. He spent hours in the captain's cabin, examining the haul, page by page, item by item. His verdict was simple. This is what we have been looking for. The materials were photographed in case the originals were lost in transit, then rushed to Bletchley Park, the Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, where Britain's codebreakers waged their secret war. There, in Hut 8, the Naval Enigma section worked under the leadership of brilliant young mathematicians including Alan Turing and Hugh Alexander. Before U-110, Hut 8 had been struggling. They had made some progress, breaking into the German naval codes briefly using material from an earlier capture, but their success was sporadic, their breaks often weeks behind current traffic. The Naval Enigma's complexity meant that even with their primitive computing machines, the bombs, breaking each day's settings, could take impossibly long. The 110 materials changed everything. With the captured settings, Bletchley could read German naval traffic immediately, without cryptanalysis. More importantly, the procedural documents, the big RAM tables, the short signal books, the indicator methods, gave them the understanding they needed for permanent penetration of the system. The effect was dramatic and almost immediate. In June 1941, Allied shipping losses stood at 432,000 tons. By August, they had plummeted to under 80,000, a reduction of more than 80%. The submarine tracking room in the Admiral could now plot U-boat positions with unprecedented accuracy. Convoys were rerouted around Wolfpack patrol lines. Ships that would have sailed into ambush were sent on safer paths. Thousands of tons of vital cargo reached Britain. Thousands of merchant sailors lived who would otherwise have drowned, and the Germans never knew. The security surrounding the capture was absolute. Within hours of the event, every man involved was sworn to silence. The operation was given a code name, Primrose. Official Admiralty records were falsified to show U-110 as sunk, not captured, a deception that would be maintained for 15 years after the war ended. The German prisoners were handled with extraordinary care. Taken first to Iceland, then to a remote camp in northern Ontario, they were held incommunicado. Their mail was monitored by cryptanalysts. In some cases, misinformation was deliberately added to their letters. They never learned their submarine had been boarded. They believed to the end of their captivity that U-110 had sunk with all its secrets. Even among the Allies, knowledge was restricted to the smallest possible circle. Churchill himself did not inform President Roosevelt until January 1942, 7 months after the capture. The ultra-secret, as the intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts came to be known, was guarded more closely than any other information in the war. First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound sent Baker Creswell a carefully worded signal. "Hearty congratulations. The petals of your flower are of rare beauty." To anyone who intercepted it, the message was meaningless. To those who understood, it confirmed the magnitude of what had been achieved. Commander Baker Creswell received the Distinguished Service Order. Sub-Lieutenant Balme received the Distinguished Service Cross. When King George VI presented Balme with his medal, he told the young officer it was perhaps the most important single event in the whole war at sea, then apologized that for security reasons the award could not be higher. Churchill would later call the staff at Bletchley Park the geese who laid the golden eggs and never cackled. The same could be said of every man who served aboard Bulldog, Broadway, and Aubritia that May afternoon. They kept the secret for decades. Many took it to their graves. The intelligence advantage gained from U-110 lasted until February 1942, when the Germans introduced a new 4-rotor Enigma machine and changed their procedures. A 10-month blackout followed. 10 months during which U-boat losses returned to catastrophic levels, proving just how valuable the Enigma intelligence had been. But the knowledge gained from U-110 was not lost. The understanding of German cryptographic procedures that Bletchley Park developed during those precious months from May 41 to February 42 enabled them to break back into the system when new codebooks were captured from U-559 in October 42. The foundations laid by the U-110 haul supported the code-breaking effort for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic would not be won until May 1943, when improved tactics, more escorts, better radar, long-range aircraft, and continued intelligence breakthroughs combined to inflict devastating losses on the U-boat fleet. In that single month, 41 German submarines were destroyed. Admiral Dönitz privately admitted that Germany had lost the battle. But the turning point had come earlier. It came on a gray afternoon in May 1941, when a 20-year-old sub-lieutenant climbed down into a sinking enemy submarine, when a telegraphist found a strange typewriter that lit up when you pressed the keys, when men formed a human chain to pass secrets up through a conning tower while their boat slowly died beneath them. The men of U-110 went to the bottom, believing their secrets had died with them. They never knew that their submarine had handed Britain the key to reading Germany's most sensitive communications. Admiral Dönitz never accepted it. When told the truth decades later, he refused to believe that Enigma had been compromised. The price of the capture was the lives of 15 German sailors, including the haunted Captain Lemp, who carried one terrible secret from the war's first day and died trying to prevent another from falling into enemy hands. David Balme lived to be 95 years old. He served throughout the war, became a fighter direction officer in the Pacific, and afterward joined his family's woolbroking business. Only in the 1970s, when the ultra-secret was finally declassified, could he speak publicly about what he had done. In his final years, he received a Bletchley Park badge and a certificate signed by the Prime Minister David Cameron, belated recognition for an afternoon's work that helped save his country. He remained modest about his role. When asked about boarding U-110, he would describe the terror of climbing down into darkness, the eerie blue light of the control room, the astonishment of finding everything intact. He remembered the plate of shrimps in the wardroom, the mashed potatoes abandoned in the engine room, small human details amid the machinery of war. In the year 2000, Hollywood released U-571, a film depicting American sailors capturing an Enigma machine from a German submarine. The historical distortion sparked outrage in Britain. The matter was raised in Parliament. Prime Minister Tony Blair expressed hope that audiences would recognize the truth about the sacrifice of British sailors. David Balme, characteristically gracious, called it a great film, noting it would not have been profitable without being Americanized. He had served as historical advisor during production. But the screenwriter later admitted publicly that the Americanization was a mercenary decision he regretted, a distortion of an event that belonged to the British sailors who risked everything on that May afternoon. The truth is this: the capture of U-110 was a British achievement, carried out by British sailors under British command, at a moment when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. It was an act of extraordinary courage undertaken without orders, without training, without any certainty of survival. King George VI called it the most important single event in the whole war at sea. The men who made it happen were forbidden to speak of it for decades. Their valor was classified. Their achievement was erased from the official record. Now, at last, their story can be told.